So Elden Ring is arguably one of the best games that's ever been created, and a few of the main reasons that stand out to me personally are the general game design, the freedom the game gives you, not just in exploration, but also in the ways that it can be played, the atmosphere that it's able to create, as well as the weight that that atmosphere has on you, and how this game utilizes a very unique way of telling a story where it feels like you're solving a mystery, piecing together various clues and threads and trying to find ways to tie them together. It's like you're solving a riddle almost. And the game wants you to learn, adapt, improvise, and overcome its challenges, and here knowledge is power, and in Elden Ring that knowledge tends to come at a price, and obtaining that knowledge can feel very long, brutal, and even laborious at times. And just because I think it's one of the greatest games ever created doesn't mean that I don't think it has flaws at all. I'm gonna share those as we walk through this. Elden Ring was a world full of intrigue and wonder where you want to leave no rock unturned and face every new twisted challenge with an air of curiosity and caution. And over time, when you gain knowledge through failure, you slowly change those emotions into an unruly confidence, and that previous element of fear just slowly dissolves away, and this feeling of bravado takes over that can only be described as come at me bro energy. And being one of the best games ever made is a very high bar to contend with, and it's even worse when that bar is self-imposed. So when it comes to this new DLC, Shadow of the Erdtree, can it carry that torch that Elden Ring sat out before it, this legacy of being a part of one of the greatest games arguably ever made? So is Shadow of the Erdtree able to carry this legacy torch that Elden Ring has set before it? So going into this DLC, my mind was I was expecting more of the same, and this DLC wouldn't be all that different. Sure, we'd get some new weapons, abilities, and get a handful of new fun bosses, but there wouldn't be anything overly groundbreaking or brand new. I kind of just expected it to be an extension of what the game had already given us. So just for a brief history, the way I played Elden Ring was very specific. But after I became Elden Lord, I ended up changing my character build just to run around the field and tie up some loose quest ends and just have a knee-slapping good time. And I ended up rolling from my spell sword, Kamehameha shooting intelligence build into a terrible strength build. I didn't follow any guides or anything like that. Quite frankly, I had no idea what I was doing. And as shameful it is to admit, I actually tried to base this character around a Dragon Ball character. And honestly, it was really fun, just running around the map with my fists and using my power level to kill enemies. And it was fun for the brief time that I ran around playing as it years ago. Now, cut to over a year later, there's a new DLC coming out, the Shadow of the Erdtree, and everyone's talking about the new way they want to play the DLC and planning out their new bleed builds, or their new spell sword builds, or how they want to use a big club build and just clobber everything. But I didn't do any of that. I kind of just charged right in. And honestly, this Broly build, it worked for a little bit. It was a fun way to explore the map, just pummeling everything to death with my hands and screaming at them. And a lot of enemies just really couldn't handle this power level. And while I wanted to stay a rage monster through the majority of this DLC, this build honestly only worked up for a little while. Ultimately, it ended up having a lot of flaws and cracks in its design, and it just didn't hold up. Now, one of the red flags thrown up by some people about this game is that it's very unrelenting compared to the base game. And while I think there's a little bit of truth to that, I think some people, myself included in this, they kind of thought they were just going to walk into the DLC with their game-winning New Game Plus 7 build and charge in here, swing their big swords around, and they were just going to sweep the floor with every single boss without much of a struggle, and then laugh at people who were having a hard time and call them filthy casuals who need to get good, and instead they got smacked in the face with their own arrogance. But this DLC used a new leveling system with the Shadow Tree fragments. So your level and everything you kind of built before didn't really matter. at all. It's almost like the game started you at level 1 with your old build, which I thought was great. And that mean you would had to progress through the game like you did in the original game. You had to learn, improvise, adapt, and overcome the situations. And unfortunately for me, my skill level with these fists and screaming, it wasn't gonna cut it at this point, not by themselves. I had officially hit my first wall, and I tried to brute force it. I even got so desperate to try to start using summons again and calling for help, but it still failed. At this point, I had to accept the fact that Broly had to evolve. And a part of this just wasn't respecking, it was finding those Shadow Tree fragments that I mentioned before. And this is a new mechanic that I actually kind of liked. It encourages you to explore the world instead of just farming the same old enemies over and over again to level up. And because you have to explore, it might lead you to a new weapon or a new area, a new gear piece. And whenever you get a new gear piece or weapon, it fills in the story a little bit, giving you a new clue, or you can even find some unique areas on the map through this exploration. So overall, I think it's a good mechanic having to make you explore in order to get stronger. So with the combination of finding these Shadow Tree fragments and ultimately respecting my build into something a little more viable and adjusting my playstyle a little bit, I had now learned, and things became significantly easier for Broly. In fact, I played this way through maybe the majority of the game, and sure, I would have my fun screaming still and punching in the overworld, but then when it came to boss fights, I would have a more methodical fun and dance with the bosses. And this reminded me of why I liked Elden Ring so much in the first place. Learning how and when to parry a boss, when to dodge, getting the moves down, and best of all, when I figured all this out, summons weren't required anymore. This to me is when Elden Ring really is at its peak. Now after defeating this first wall and exploring a little more after, I started falling into the groove of Elden Ring overall again, and I was really enjoying the game. But then I encountered 3 bosses in a row that just really highlighted to me what some of the weakest parts of this game, and these are what I call the beast bosses. The first of this trio was the Dancing Lion, 2 zombie guys in a suit that are wielding the elements with a furious and unwieldy speed. Then it was the Shadow Tree Avatar, which to me seemed like Winnie the Pooh's house on bath salts. And then there was the Golden Hippo, that also seemed to be a bit of a Dragon Ball fan because it turned Super Saiyan on you for some unknown reason. And these bosses to me, they just weren't that fun to play against. And these weren't the only ones like this. We can talk about some more of them as they come later on. But these were just the first 3 I encountered, and I happened to encounter them back to back. And maybe I'm making some excuses, but these fights, they feel more 40-60 on that you're not just fighting the boss, you're also fighting the camera and the controls in general, and you're just hoping they don't do some crazy fast move off the side of the camera that you can't see or react to correctly. It feels a little bit like chance. I did quickly learn on these bosses that not using the targeting system was extremely helpful, as it made some of their moves not function correctly, allowing you to get a few more opening hits, and just leaning into Broly's strength more, using the 2-handed stance and causing knockdowns, it just felt good. But it still wasn't as fun as the methodical dance that you have on bosses like Relania or Mesmer, which I will talk about Mesmer in a bit, don't worry. And while the Dancing Lion was a bit of a spectacle, he gets a lot of style points in my book. He truly was a unique type of boss, I felt. The other 2, I didn't really feel that way. The Shadow Tree Avatar, I didn't really enjoy that boss at all. Made me use a summon because I just straight up wasn't having fun fighting him, and I got sick of trying. And this kind of became my general rule at this point, that once I felt a boss was just becoming unfun to learn and play against, I just whip out my Spirit Ash and usually make short work of them, and this only happened twice in the game. And when I say I didn't enjoy these 3 bosses much, I really didn't enjoy them. It honestly made me debate putting the game down at times. I didn't want to spend an hour or so learning a boss that I'm just not having fun fighting. It reminded me of how much I did not like the final boss in the original Elden Ring, the Elden Beast, and sure, he had visual opulence, but these bosses, they just aren't fun to me as the methodical dance type. To me, they feel way more luck-based, in hoping that the game mechanics and camera don't screw you over completely. And at times, it feels like the boss is almost unbound and playing with a different rule set. It's like the boss is using cheat codes and tactics that just aren't available to you, and you're stuck with this rigid set of rules. Now, could it just be because of the playstyle I was using at the time? Maybe. But I recall feeling this way too when I was still a mage. Now, while these 3 bosses did leave me feeling a little bit dispirited, Mesmer actually brought me right back in. And while it took me a little longer than I care to admit to defeat him, it was a boss that followed that methodical dance style that I really love. When you die to him, it feels like you did something wrong, like you didn't dodge the attack correctly, you mistimed what you were doing, you parried the wrong move, or you got arrogant and tried to attack him during his turn. And these are the things that I feel like you can actually learn from and get better from next time, even though in the moment they can feel a little bit overly punishing. Mesmer had a unique and fun design, he was visually interesting to look at, and just overall the theme of the fight felt engaging. So after exploring Mesmer's Black Keep and ultimately defeating him, I ended up going to the Runes of Rom, and I was honestly feeling pretty blissful about this game again. I enjoyed the atmosphere of the runes, despite its fat rat and incredibly bad bug problem. And sure, the Scarlet Rot was back here with the little shrimps, but they weren't as bad or as oppressive as in the previous base game, and the boss here honestly wasn't that bad. I enjoyed her visually, and she felt like an odd mix of a beast style and a dance style, but I did find her to be just way easier than most of the other bosses I had faced at this point, and it felt like there was no real build-up or mystique around her. It just felt like she kind of came out of nowhere. But what I didn't realize here is that there was a big problem brewing. I was unknowingly crit pathing this game, and by defeating her and lighting the tree behind her on fire, I ended up in this new sky castle, which at the time, I couldn't leave. And everything in this castle felt just a little bit more difficult than it should have. And while Broly's power was indeed maximum, some of these enemies, like these awesome lion guys, they just proved to be way more trouble than they were worth. I mean, seriously, these guys were straight up terrors. I actually avoided the last two just completely altogether and ended up sleuthing around instead with my tail between my legs. And the whole time I was kind of desperately hoping that I could just return to the world map because I kind of didn't really want to be here yet. But eventually I found a room with what I imagine was probably an optional fight. And even though I hid from the big scary kitty cats, I was loosely role-playing as a Saiyan right now, so I didn't want to turn this optional fight down. And in this fight, a lot of the NPCs that you met during this game end up turning on you. And now the prospects of a 1v4, they'd probably sound good to some people, but I had a much different idea for this fight.
Capcom presents.
Ready?
New Age of Heroes.
I decided to turn this into Marvel vs. Capcom, and this may have trivialized the fight, sure, but it made the fight way more fun to me, and when I'm playing games I like to have fun, so it is what it is. Now, shortly after taking first place in my little mini Evo tournament, I found myself fighting Radahn. Now, at this point, just from being on the internet, I had spoiled myself and knew he was the final boss, and I was wondering how the hell I got here because, one, I didn't want to be here. 2, I knew there was a ton to the DLC I had yet to see and explore. 3, maybe one of the more important reasons, is that Broly straight up wasn't ready for Radahn. But what annoyed me the most here wasn't how strong Radahn was. I was only maybe Shadow Tree level 8 at the time, so I knew this wasn't going to happen for me. But the game ended up kind of forcing me here when I set that tree on fire, even though from the start I tried and wanted to leave. And little did I know that as fun as my Marvel vs. Capcom fight was, it had broken a lot of quests for me, which was kind of important later on. So after getting a good old-fashioned whooping from Radahn and me dying a lot, I knew that now I get to go enjoy the game and explore again. I get to find those Shadow Tree fragments to get stronger, and I get to start my trading montage. Unfortunately, the first trading partner I found was arguably one of the worst bosses in the game, Commander Gaius. And Commander Gaius is one of those bosses that pretty much, as I mentioned before, highlights everything I don't like about the beast-type bosses, and he just overall wasn't fun to play against. His attacks were relentless, and half the time you couldn't see him, and it just felt like a poorly executed fight, and his dodge windows were very thin and very narrow. It took me only a handful of tries before I reached my limit and said screw it and whipped out my Spirit Ash, which, funny enough, completely made him a joke. Now, I honestly feel like this fight was a bit of a lost opportunity. This made me think a lot about Twilight Princess, this fight, with the fight against King Bublin, which honestly there was a lot in Elden Ring overall and this DLC that made me think of Twilight Princess. But in this boss fight, Link fights this boss on a horse, and I feel like Commander Gaius should have kind of been themed around using your horse Torn, a mount versus mount fight. And I really think that the fact that there is a lack of a proper mounted boss fight in this game is a little bit of a missed opportunity. Sure, there are the world bosses like the dragons and hippos and fire golems, which I'll talk about much later on, and these can be done on Torrent, but these bosses are very hit and run battles, which they feel more tedious than fun and well designed. But once I put the commander down, I really did start to enjoy the game again for what it was, and also the fact that now my official training can start, and this involved fighting all kinds of things like bears, this awesome looking Death Knight boss, some random samurai, random hippos, and then I found something way more interesting when I was exploring, something way more intense, something that we could conquer, and that was fear, that was madness, as when you reach this abyssal woods, your horse Torrent is too scared to even join you in your endeavors. Now, while I like this idea of Torrent being kind of scared in this area, it makes sense and adds to the theme of everything. It did kind of feel cheesy, and I'm not sure if this was executed in the best way. It felt like they tried to take the area of Caelid and the Lake of Rot and sort of make it into the theme of madness now, but the zone overall felt like it had less, and it left a lot to be desired, as this was a huge area. And there really isn't much going on here other than the rats and the scary creeper guys. I just think if there was a few more creatures affected by this madness thrown in here, it could have went a long way. I mean, the base game already had trolls that were infected by madness, and there really wasn't much to do here in terms of loot or Shadow Tree fragments. It just kind of seemed like a big spooky bog that was empty, and it honestly didn't feel that great or that fun to explore overall. Now, the theming and the atmosphere here were really on point, but gameplay wise it felt flat to me. Now, after navigating this Florida wilderness called the Abyssal Woods, you end up reaching the manor where madness has taken over, and honestly I really like this mansion and this dungeon, and even more so the boss Midra. He made up for everything that the bog lacked, in my opinion. And Midra was not only visually neat, but he was one of those good bosses that was a methodical dance, and I just enjoyed fighting him overall. He really, like Mesmer did before, brought me back into the game full swing. Now, after conquering the Sphere of Madness, I turned my attention to the southern coast, which the contrast here with the bright, vibrant, illuminating blue flowers in the zone compared to the damp, musky, sweat-stained, crusty beach towel that was the Abyssal Woods, it was super refreshing. But here, in this southern coast, I took Broly on a magical journey where we went down deep into a hole to fight rock-hard, one-eyed snake monsters with our bare hands that, when excited, can shoot eye lasers at you and explode all over you. And then, at the end of it, we fought a Jizz Knight so we could drink some lady's death milk. Yeah, it was a little weird and odd, but it was very on brand for this game, actually. I was kind of annoyed here, though, because there was a quest that I completely fumbled because I accidentally crit pathed the game, as I mentioned before, so I couldn't engage with this quest any longer, which was a bit disappointing. And while I did kind of like this area, I wasn't that impressed with the Jizz Knight. I maybe at this point was a little bit overleveled, as a lot of these later bosses did feel very easy to me. But looks aside, this boss just kind of left something to be desired. He had a little bit of interest to him, but I don't know, he just fell flat. I would say him and the Scarlet Rot Lady are probably on par for me, but don't worry, the phallic adventures of Broly didn't end here. We did run into some old friends, the Tree Sentinels, but now Broly had upgraded. Instead of manhandling these phallic rocks, he was now completely blowing them. Wait, what are we doing here? How is this making Broly stronger? Is this just self-exploration or something? Anyway, these Mother of Fingers quests were pretty fun, especially since they gave some big story revelations around the origins of the fingers and what's going on with them. And there were some fun twists and turns here and some unique boss designs. I thought the tickle monster you fight at the end, I found them just visually neat, and I thought they were kind of cool. And while I didn't like a lot of the beast boss in this game, I thought this one felt more fair than the others for some reason. Now, at this point, I had done the majority of areas in the DLC, all but one, and some would say this was the best area.
Bayle! Vile Bayle! Oh, terror incarnate!
Here, I started my quest with Egon and his revenge against Bayle, the Dread Dragon. I waded through Dragon Men, a Valley of Death, and even got a dragon-slaying katana, and we began to climb up this giant mountain full of dragons and their corpses. Perfect training for Bayle and Radahn, and this area really again reminded me of Zelda. It really made me think of the classic Death Mountain on N64 and climbing up it as Link, only this was way more epic. The build up here with the world building, it was all really amazing. It was thematically riveting, and it was incredibly cinematic with how they showed these giant stormy vistas. This felt like one of the best area build-ups that FromSoft has ever done. by far. And I was seeing tons of buzz online from tons of people saying the boss at the summit, Bayle, is one of the best bosses in the game, and this is one of the best parts of the game. I was getting really hyped up, and while I can't describe the tension leading up to this, the buzz that ignites at you, and when you're climbing up with this memorable NPC Egon as he's hyping you up and getting you pumped, all while you're following this trail of corpses leading to this epic climax at the top of the mountain. It all just feels amazing. And then you fight Bayle, and I'd hate to say it, but visually and gameplay wise, I didn't find Bayle that interesting. I get that Bayle had this crazy fight with the other dragon lord, and he's all battle scarred, and he has this other dragon's head that's ripped off and attached and part of him, but honestly to me, when he's running around and attacking, he looks like a Cornish hen, roasted until golden brown. And Bayle also had some of the problems that I have with larger beast-type monsters, where his size and speed make camera controls a little bit more difficult than the boss itself at times. Now, he's not nearly as terrible as some of the other bosses in this game, but for me, I didn't think this fight was all that enjoyable, and it isn't because he killed me a bunch and it took me hours. Honestly, I beat him rather quick. Now, I did bring Egon with me because thematically that just felt correct, and who knows, maybe Egon did completely carry me through the fight, and I would admit it was a pretty close fight, but Bayle was actually one of the few bosses that I used my fists for instead of my sword. So maybe it's because I spoiled myself a bit and heard all the fervor around him that my expectations were super high. Then you add the incredible buildup of going up this mountain that I mentioned before and being gassed up the whole time. I was expecting him to be this spectacle of a dragon that was mind-blowing, but it ultimately to me just felt like I was fighting an oversized rotisserie chicken that was zipping around and spewing yellow explosions everywhere. Sure, when he got his wings it looked kind of cool, but overall it just didn't do much for me. To me, this felt about as satisfying as eating a rotisserie chicken over the sink after a Costco trip. You get excited, you know it's coming, and the journey's great. You grab some cool stuff on the way, and maybe you even made a friend with the sample clerk. But at the summit of the kitchen sink, where you have to face this malformed chicken, you find the thought and the buildup of devouring that bagged, hot and ready Costco chicken to be way more satisfying than the actual act itself, as afterwards you just feel a little bit let down and greasy, especially if you end up wearing Egan's clothes at the end. Nasty. Right, that is a little bit of a half troll. I mean, he is a neat boss, but I just personally don't like his stubby dragon look design. It just doesn't elicit dread to me. Now, after defeating Bayle, I started rounding up the last remaining Shadow Tree fragments, and I did actually end up missing one, but even with that, I felt like I was ready for this fight against what some people are claiming to be one of the hardest FromSoft bosses made, Promised Consort Radahn. And this nut did take me some time to crack, but I had a lot of fun learning the first phase and getting his patterns down. When to parry, when to dodge, and it started to feel really good after a while. I felt I was making progress, but then something happened at 50%, just like other bosses. Phase 2, where Mikula lends her power to an already prime Radahn in a very classic way.
Oh, what should we call you?
Huh?
To I, Mikula, and my promised consort, Radahn.
And this form was pretty relentless and unforgiving to learn. This was actually the first boss that I sat down and watched a video on so I could properly understand what exactly was happening, because learning phase 2 was extremely punishing and quite frankly hard to do. So after reviewing the fight tapes, adjusting my gear loadout, and practicing and applying this for a few hours, the final boss was defeated. And he did get me very close to using my Mimic tier, and I even thought of trying that cheesy shield wall poke build that's been going around that looks like the easy way, but I don't know, playing like that didn't look fun to me. Like how using summons or any of the other fun, interesting tools this game offers to you isn't fun to some other tryhards. But this game is meant for fun, so do what you have to do to keep your sanity and play how you want. I was honestly very invested in trying to parry him down. That's what I really wanted to do, and it really felt satisfying. Would it have felt better if I used my fists and my raging shout to defeat him? Yeah, it probably would have, but I don't think that was in the cards for me, and I'm very happy with how I ended up defeating him and happy to be done with this DLC. And that was kind of my overall gameplay story for this game. And this is meant to be a little bit of a review overall though. And I've shared some thoughts and walked through you what I was thinking at the time with Broly and where my head was at, like the things around the beast bosses and how I found zones like the Abyssal Woods cool thematically, but a little bit of a letdown. And one of the things I didn't cover in this journey though was a lot of the exploration bits and some of the world bosses. Now, exploration to me is one of the big factors in Elden Ring, and compared to the main game, which makes you want to wander around and leave no stone unturned, this game did feel a little bit different. It used a lot more verticality within the zones. While I did enjoy exploring some of the areas of this DLC, and while some of the vista shots are way more beautiful than in the previous version, I feel like the exploration just didn't hit the same high notes. And as for the field bosses, most kind of felt a little bit copy-paste. Most were returning with minor tweaks. I actually enjoyed the bears for some reason way more than the other bosses, but I kind of wish they kept all the dragons just to Bayle's Mountain alone, and even maybe changed and tweaked their attack styles up just a little bit more. And while visually I sort of like the fire golems, after fighting one or two of them, they just kind of became boring and tedious to fight. The hippos kind of felt the same way as the fire golems, although since both of these are new, I'll kind of let them slide a little bit. But I just feel like if the hippos, they were going to put them in each region, just give them a little bit more flair, like have a madness one in the woods or one that does sleep in the coast, or I don't know. It would have felt nice to diversify them in another way beyond just the boss version turning into a Super Saiyan. Now, there's definitely some buzz around the fact that Radahn as a final boss was a little bit of a letdown, mostly because you do fight a version of him in the base game, albeit a zombie fight and much weaker version. And while I think the idea of fighting a primed Radahn is pretty cool, it does feel like a little bit of a letdown for it being the final boss. I honestly did though really enjoy phase 1 of his fight. It was phase 2 that was a little bit more punishing. But when I think back to the base game, I didn't really like the final boss in that game either. The Elden Beast I felt was a bit of a letdown. Sure, he was this crazy visual spectacle that was a sight to behold, but gameplay wise, he wasn't fun, and honestly I would take Radahn over Elden Beast pretty much any day. Now I think another factor that I liked here is the story. I like the idea that Mikla had to give up pieces of himself in order to become a god on his quest to usher in this age of kindness, but he makes the mistake of giving up love, and it kind of makes you wonder how you expect yourself to bring forth a age of compassion and kindness when you no longer have love in your heart, and the means in which you are seizing this power is through questionable means of subjugation and bending the minds and hearts of men. I thought it was just a cool overall concept. There's lots of other neat story threads in here, like the finger story, and I actually got to miss out on some of the quests, but I'm sure over the course of the next few months I'll watch lore videos every now and then like most people to piece these clues together. Now the main question I posed at the start of this video was, can Shadow of the Erdtree hold the legacy and carry that torch of it being the best game of all time that Elden Ring was? And did it give us what we wanted? I think one of the reasons that Elden Ring got elevated to such a high extent is we didn't know what to expect really, and it greatly exceeded any expectations anyone had. It was radically different from any FromSoft game at the time, and it blew expectations out of the water. And I think that's a big hindrance that Shadow of the Erdtree has working against it, is now we sort of know what to expect, and we now have very high expectations. But I think one thing to keep in mind here is that this game is a DLC and not a sequel. Honestly, I could see other game companies piecing out this large DLC into multiple things. I could see something like Season 1, Valania the Moon Knight, and Season 2, Mesmer the Impaler and his Black Keep, and Season 3, Bayle the Dread Dragon. And we would just be charged premium prices for all of these, where we got this very, very large and generous sized DLC for a very appropriate value that I feel they could have easily charged way more for. But I would say if this game was branded and marketed as Elden Ring 2, I would kind of be a little bit disappointed. I think it still did carry the torch of it, but I just felt like even though it gave us the new weapons and a lot of the new things we wanted, the exploration just wasn't as good. The level of immersion I didn't feel was as good. And when I say this felt like less, I don't mean that in just size alone. Again, this is a DLC, not a sequel. I wouldn't expect it to be bigger than the main game. The areas didn't feel as lively and as full. It just felt like it lacked just a small amount of the original charm Elden Ring did have. Not to say this was terrible by any means. I'm not trying to say that, where if Elden Ring was like a 10, this would easily be like a 9 right behind it. I will say I think some of the bosses in this game were some of the better bosses, mostly like Valania and Mesmer, even first phase Radahn to an extent, I think were definitely up there in the best bosses of the overall game. but it also had some weak ones. And maybe there's some bias here, but I just really didn't enjoy some of the beast type bosses like Gaius and the tree avatar. And there are some beast bosses I liked, don't get me wrong, like the dancing beast and Bayle to some extent. On these bosses, you just kind of see the cracks and faults in the camera, and they tend to show a little bit more with these bosses. And overall though, I still think this is a really good DLC. Don't get me wrong. I'm just holding it to an unbelievably high standard because Elden Ring is arguably one of the best games ever made. For FromSoft DLC, this is kind of the standard of what you would usually expect. I don't know, maybe because Elden Ring was way more than we expected. I thought that might happen again with this for some reason. But I think overall, if you enjoyed Elden Ring and you wanted more and a little bit more challenge, I think you would definitely enjoy this. I don't see why you wouldn't. Would I consider this required reading for the game? Probably not. I think the base game pretty much delivers a full experience, and all this DLC really does is add a couple more bosses and unique areas. It doesn't add anything greatly special. It has a lot more of the same experience, just with different enemy types, which isn't a bad thing because the same was the best game of all time. And this DLC really is just the cherry on top. So do I think it's worth playing it though? Yes, I do. Before I close this out, one thing that's kind of sticking out to me is we're supposedly not getting another Elden Ring DLC, but that seems a little odd to me because the main game, the world is called The Lands Between, and now we've gone down to the Shadow Realm. Kind of makes me think that there would have been another DLC to kind of sandwich the game as a whole, you know? The Lands Between is the cream of the Oreo. This is the bottom half. We need the top half. And there's still a lot of unanswered questions. So it does leave me scratching my head a little bit of how they've said there isn't another one. Maybe that's a lie, but yeah, that's kind of just where my head's at with this whole DLC. I think it's a great DLC. I don't think it was as good as the original, but I think as a DLC, you know, it carries a torch and continues the legacy of the game. But as always, let me know why I'm wrong. Try fast, take chances. Later, nerds.
Lord of the Old Order, let us go together.